Should non-citizens have a say in local elections, or does that undermine the very essence of citizenship? Are we opening the door to foreign influence? Are voter ID laws a necessary safeguard against fraud, or do they unfairly target and disenfranchise minority and low-income voters? What's the real threat to our democracy? Is allowing non-citizen voting a step towards a more inclusive society, or does it disincentivize the pursuit of full citizenship and dilute the value of the naturalization process?
Welcome back to the Mass Debate channel and today's episode, where we dive into the heated debate over non-citizen voting and voter ID laws. Are we fostering inclusivity or risking our democracy? Join us as we explore the arguments shaping America's electoral landscape. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.
All right, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that always seems to get people fired up: voter ID laws and non-citizen voting. We've got a ton of research and different viewpoints to unpack here.
It's kind of like one of those political thrillers.
Yeah.
Except, this is real life and affects how millions of people vote.
Exactly. And we're going to break it all down, starting with the basics. Voter ID laws across the U.S., 36 states have them, but it's not a simple yes or no situation, is it?
Nope, not at all. You can almost think of it like ordering a coffee. You've got your basic requirement, like you need some kind of ID. But then it gets tricky. Strict photo ID, non-strict photo ID. Even some places don't require a photo. Gets complicated fast.
So strict means you absolutely got to have that photo ID at the polls, or your vote might not count.
Exactly. And if you don't have it on election day, you might have to go to a government office later with your ID to make sure your vote gets counted. Then you've got the non-strict states. They still prefer a photo ID, but if you forget it, maybe you can sign something saying it's you, or a poll worker can vouch for you.
Okay, so a little wiggle room there. But why even have these different categories in the first place?
Well, that gets right to the heart of the whole argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The strict side says it's all about security, making sure no one's pretending to be someone else at the polls. They make comparisons like showing your ID to get on a plane or cash a check. It's about trust and making sure things are legit.
I can see that. But the other side says in-person voter fraud is super rare. So strict voter ID laws are kind of like a solution for a problem that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, and they use stats to back that up. The Week of Women Voters, citing the Brennan Center, say the chance of someone actually impersonating another voter at the polls is something like 0.000004%. You're more likely to get hit by lightning.
Wow, that's incredibly rare. So the question becomes, is all this extra security worth the hassle for voters, especially for people who might have a tough time getting an ID?
Right, exactly.
And it's interesting that some states, like Oklahoma, kind of do both. They're technically a photo ID state, but they'll also accept those non-photo voter registration cards.
That's a good point. It's almost like they're trying to look tough on security by being a photo ID state, but they also know it can be hard for some folks to get those IDs, so they give that other option. Makes you wonder if it's more about politics than, like, actual risk.
It's like they're trying to please everyone. But it also makes you think about who might be most affected by these stricter ID laws.
Yeah, for sure. Groups like the ACLU are concerned that requiring certain types of ID could make it harder for minority voters. They might face more hurdles getting those documents. And it's all tied to the history of voter suppression in this country, where certain tactics were used to stop specific groups from voting.
So it's not just about whether someone has an ID, but how easy or difficult it is to even get one in the first place.
Exactly. Can't forget about that. That's a really important point to remember as we dig deeper into all this.
All right, so we've laid some groundwork. We see the different types of voter ID laws and the arguments for and against them. But what about the claims from the folks who support these laws? For example, they often say that voter ID laws don't actually lead to lower minority voter turnout.
Yeah, that's a common one. And a group called the Heritage Foundation, their conservative think tank, they even point to research from, 2007 and 2019. They say those studies found no negative impact on turnout after these laws were put in place.
So at first glance, it sounds like they've got a point. But I wonder if those studies are missing something. Like, what about those subtle things that might discourage people from voting? Things that wouldn't necessarily show up in the data?
You're right. Relying only on statistics can be misleading. We have to consider what's called the chilling effect. It's the idea that some folks might just give up before even trying to vote because they think it'll be too hard. They hear about needing an ID and assume it's too much hassle, even if they could technically get the right documents.
So even if the numbers don't show a big drop in turnout, there could be a whole group of people who just don't even try. That's a little unsettling, honestly.
It is. And it shows how important it is to look beyond the raw data. We need to listen to the experiences of actual voters, especially folks who have historically had trouble voting.
We can't forget about that human element. But supporters of voter ID laws also say these laws are popular. Didn't one of our sources have a poll showing that a lot of people support them?
Yeah, there was a Monmouth University poll. Found that 80% of Americans are in favor of requiring photo ID to vote.
80%. Wow, that seems pretty clear-cut. How do you even argue with that level of support?
Oh, well, you got to remember that polls can be influenced by, how the questions are worded and by all the stuff we hear in the media and from politicians.
Yeah.
For example, if someone's constantly being told about voter fraud, even if it's not really happening that much, they might think needing a photo ID is just common sense.
So that 80% might not be as straightforward as it looks. Maybe people like the idea without really understanding the details or the downsides.
Yeah, exactly. It just shows that we need to think critically about polls and try to understand why people feel the way they do.
Okay, this is definitely way more complicated than it seems at first. But there's one more piece to this puzzle we need to talk about. Non-citizen voting. Seems like every election this comes up, usually with a lot of strong opinions.
It does.
Yeah.
And it's often used to make people scared and divided. So let's cut through all that and get to the facts. First off, it is illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal and state elections in the U.S. No question about it.
All right, that's the law. But then there's this idea that millions of non-citizens are voting illegally, that they're swinging elections and messing with our democracy. Where does that even come from?
That's a classic example of misinformation, often used to help certain political agendas. Our sources, the Heritage Foundation, Brennan Center, and the Migration Policy Institute, they all agree that non-citizen voting is super rare. We're not talking millions, not even thousands. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of voters.
That's a huge difference. But one of our sources did say there are some places where non-citizens can vote. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. 16 places in the U.S. allow non-citizens to vote, but, and this is important, it's only for local elections.
So things like school board elections or city council races, but not for president or Congress.
Exactly. And it's not widespread, just a small number of places, usually with very specific rules. Like San Francisco lets non-citizen parents and guardians vote in school board elections.
Right.
The idea is that if your kids are in the school system, you should have say in how it's run, whether you're a citizen or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're directly affected by those decisions, so you should have some input.
Exactly. It's about making sure that people who are most affected by local policies have a voice.
Okay, so we've cleared that up. Non-citizen voting in federal and state elections is against the law, and it's really rare. And there are a few exceptions at the local level, but it still makes you wonder, how do states actually check if someone's a citizen when they register to vote?
That's where things get interesting. And maybe not as reassuring as you'd expect. It's not some super high-tech, foolproof system.
Wait, so they're not running, like, FBI background checks on everyone?
Haha, no, not quite. It mostly relies on info from databases like the DMV and Social Security, and people just have to swear under oath on the registration form that they're a citizen.
So it's basically hoping people are honest and then checking that against some other records.
Yeah, pretty much. But then there's another thing that makes it even more complicated. Automatic voter registration.
You mean like when you get registered to vote, when you get your driver's license? Seems convenient, but I can see how that could cause some problem.
Exactly. Because if someone who's not a citizen gets a driver's license, they might accidentally get registered to vote, even though they shouldn't be.
Whoops. Talk about unintended consequences. And speaking of those, didn't one of our sources mention a case in Texas where this whole system really messed up?
You're thinking of the time when Texas officials thought almost 100,000 people might be non-citizens. They used bad data and flagged all these people. It turned out to be a huge mistake, which shows just how easy it is for these systems to prevent people who should be able to vote from voting.
That's a big reminder that even when we try to do the right thing, the system can still have serious flaws and hurt people.
It does. And it brings us back to that question of balance. How do we protect our elections without making it too hard for people to vote, especially for people who already face a lot of obstacles?
All right, so we've covered a lot in this first part. The different types of voter ID laws, the pros and cons, the reality of non-citizen voting, and how the systems we use to verify citizenship aren't always that great.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to talk about. In the next part, we'll look closer at how these laws might actually play out and what's really at stake for our democracy.
Definitely don't want to miss that. Stick with us as we continue our deep dive into voter ID laws and non-citizen voting. Back again for more of our deep dive into voter ID laws and non-citizen voting. We've already seen how this is a really complex issue, and that the systems we have in place aren't exactly perfect.
Right, and as we dig deeper, we got to remember that these aren't just like abstract debates.
Yeah.
This stuff has real consequences for real people, especially people who are already marginalized or face barriers.
Absolutely. We can't forget about the human impact of these laws.
Exactly. And to understand that impact, we need to go beyond the numbers and actually hear from people who are affected. Like, think about getting a photo ID. For a lot of us, it's pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Go to the DMV, show some documents, pay a fee, done.
Yeah, a minor inconvenience, but not a huge deal.
Right. But for some people, it's not that easy. They might not have transportation or can't take time off work, or maybe they have trouble getting all the documents they need. And these barriers are often worse for people of color, low-income folks, and people in rural areas.
So even if you're eligible to vote, getting an ID could be so hard that you just can't vote.
That's exactly it. It creates this hidden cost, a barrier that doesn't always show up in those studies that say voter ID laws don't affect turnout.
It's almost like a hidden poll tax. You're not directly charging people to vote, but you're making it harder in a way that disproportionately affects certain groups.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it connects back to the history of voter suppression in America, like we talked about before. Throughout history, there have been deliberate efforts to stop certain people from voting, especially black voters and other minorities.
Things like literacy tests and poll taxes, those were specifically designed to disenfranchise black voters, especially in the Jim Crow South.
Exactly. And while we've gotten rid of those overt tactics, critics argue that voter ID laws are a more subtle way to do the same thing. They achieve a similar result without being explicitly discriminatory.
So it's not just about the law itself, but also the reason behind it and the historical context.
Yeah, exactly. You can't separate those things.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about non-citizen voting. We already said it's illegal and super uncommon, but I'm curious, why would someone even risk breaking the law to vote if they're not eligible?
That's an interesting question, and researchers have looked into it. It's not always about trying to cheat or sway an election. Sometimes it's just an honest misunderstanding. Someone might think they can vote because they have a green card, or they've lived in the U.S. for a long time.
So not necessarily bad intentions, just confusion about how the system works.
Right, and sometimes it's about wanting to be involved in their community. They might feel strongly about where they live and want to participate in decisions that affect them, even if they're not citizens yet.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Especially in those places where non-citizens were allowed to vote in local elections. Like, if you can vote for your kid's school board, you might want to have a say.
Yeah, for sure. And it shows how complex this all is. We have to realize that people have their reasons for wanting to vote, even if they're not technically allowed to.
It reminds us that we're dealing with real people, with their own reasons and situations. And it's not always a simple question of right and wrong or legal and illegal.
Absolutely. And as we keep talking about this, we need to be nuanced and understanding, recognizing that there's often a lot of gray area.
All right, that's a good point. But let's get back to voter ID laws for a minute. We talked about how they might make it harder for some people to vote, but what about the argument that they make elections more secure?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And the answer is, as usual, complicated. People who like voter ID laws say they prevent in-person voter impersonation. You know, where someone pretends to be someone else at the polls.
Right, that image of someone showing up and voting under someone else's name. It's a scary thought, but is it really happening?
Well, that's where the data comes in. Like we mentioned before, lots of studies show that in-person voter impersonation is super rare.
Like finding a needle in a haystack rare.
Pretty much. Even the biggest supporters of voter ID laws have a hard time showing that this type of fraud is widespread, or that these laws would actually stop it.
So it seems like the security argument is more about how it makes people feel than about an actual threat.
That's a good way to put it. It plays on people's worries about elections being rigged, even if those worries aren't based on much evidence.
But we also have to think about the unintended consequences of these laws, right? Like the possibility of mistakes and people losing their right to vote.
Absolutely. That case in Texas we talked about is a perfect example of how these systems can go wrong. even when people are trying to do the right thing. It shows how important it is to have strong oversight and ways to hold people accountable so that people who are allowed to vote aren't wrongly flagged or denied their right.
So it's not enough to just pass a law. You also have to make sure it's put into practice fairly and effectively, and that it doesn't create new problems.
Exactly. And that means thinking carefully about the trade-offs involved.
Okay, I think we're really starting to understand how complicated this issue is. We've seen how voter ID laws might make it harder for some people to vote, how the threat of non-citizen voting is often exaggerated, and how the systems we use to check citizenship aren't that reliable.
And in the last part of our deep dive, we'll explore some potential solutions and talk about how we can make sure our elections are both secure and accessible for everyone who's eligible to vote.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with the final part of this important discussion. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into this whole voter ID and non-citizen voting thing, and it's clear there are some real concerns on both sides of this issue.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just numbers and legal jargon. We're talking about fundamental stuff here. Fairness, access, the core of what makes our democracy work.
Right, and so the big question is, where do we go from here? How do we make sure our elections are both secure and accessible? How do we protect the system while also making sure everyone who's eligible can vote without a ton of hassle?
That's the challenge, right? Finding that balance where security and accessibility can actually coexist. I think we need to move past all the arguing and focus on solutions.
I like that. Let's brainstorm. What kind of solutions could address those concerns from both sides?
Well, when it comes to security, I think it's crucial to really invest in our election infrastructure. Make it strong and resilient against any threats,
Okay, so like upgrading voting machines, better cybersecurity, thorough audits, things like that.
Exactly. We need to be confident in the systems themselves instead of focusing so much on individual voters and their IDs.
Makes sense. And what about making voting more accessible?
Well, we need to make registering and voting easier, not harder. Expanding early voting periods, maybe making Election Day a national holiday automatic voter registration, and making sure polling places are easy to get to and well-staffed.
Those are great ideas. And what about people who might have trouble getting an ID?
We need creative solutions there. Some states have programs that provide free or low-cost IDs to voters who need them. Others have different ways to verify someone's identity, like signing an affidavit or having a poll worker vouch for them.
So thinking outside the box a little, finding ways to accommodate people who might not have a driver's license or passport handy.
Exactly. And recognizing that there's no one perfect solution for every state or community they might need to tailor their approaches based on their unique situations.
Flexibility seems key here.
It is. And we can't forget about public education. We need to make sure voters have accurate information about their rights, the registration process, all the different options available to them.
Right. It's not enough to just have the laws and systems in place. People need to know how to use them and exercise their right to vote.
Absolutely. Informed voters are the foundation of a healthy democracy.
I agree completely. But even with the best systems and educated voters, there's always a chance for mistakes or even intentional manipulation. How do we make sure elections are truly fair and accurate?
That's where we need independent oversight and accountability. Strong election commissions, nonpartisan observers, and solid auditing procedures to catch any problems or potential fraud.
Checks and balances to keep everything transparent and fix any issues quickly.
Exactly. Every vote needs to be counted accurately, and the results should reflect what the people actually want.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, from election security and voter access to ensuring fair and accurate results. But it all comes back to our shared responsibility to protect the right to vote.
You said it, voting is fundamental to our democracy, and it's up to all of us to make sure it's accessible, secure, and represents the will of the people.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a challenge. Stay involved, stay informed, and speak up for policies that make our democracy stronger and ensure that everyone's voice is heard.
The future of our democracy depends on all of us working together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And remember, your vote is your voice. Make sure you use it.
Non-citizen voices rise. On the borderlines they shine and they dance. Conservatives say it's a right to protect. Undeniably liberals argue for a chance. In the halls of power voices clash. One side says it's only fair. The others cautious with worries in the air. Balancing democracy with care. We must prepare, mate, this time either black or white. Find the common ground or we'll never see the light. Listening, learning, evolving the night. Together we unite, our future in sight.